Yes.
Okay, good. Good evening, everybody. My name is Daniel Hartwig. I'm the head of special collections and university archives, and I'd like to welcome you tonight to our discussion with Helen Gunderson, whose new book is entitled The Road I Grew Up On, Requiem for a Vanishing Era. Also with us tonight is Dr. Cornelia Butler, the Charles F. Curtis Distinguished Professor of Agriculture and Sociology Emerita, Iowa State University, and Research Professor, Kansas State University, who will help us examine local history and other themes explored in Helen's book through her own significant lens. Tonight's discussion will begin with some moderated questions before opening up for questions from attendees at 6:45. Feel free if you'd like to ask follow-up questions or anything in the chat, and I'll try and monitor that as we go. And then at the end, we'll break for an informal social hour, so feel free to stick around and ask questions off topic if you're interested. So I'd like to first thank the sponsors for tonight's event, the Iowa State University Library and the Ames Public Library, whose missions involve preserving and providing access to information for the public good. Tonight's topic, local history, is one such topic that we in the archival profession particularly focus on when trying to document and understand the context behind social and cultural developments. The materials we acquire and preserve serve as fodder for research and debate, as well as for reflection and understanding. Thanks to Helen and other donors of primary resources, generations of researchers will be able to examine firsthand historical accounts in myriad formats, in ever new ways, in answering ever new questions. I am pleased now to introduce tonight's speakers. First up, Helen Gunderson, urban farmer, gardener, advocate for the use of locally grown food, baker, friend of 4 cats and 9 laying hens, steward of farmland in the Northwest Iowa, photographer, videographer, oral historian, archivist, donor, and author. A Jane of all trades, Helen joins us from her home in Ames, Iowa. Welcome, Helen.
Thank you. Recently, I stumbled onto some YouTube videos, like interviews Stephen Colbert and Julie Andrews, and I liked the outfit she wore. And then I saw one with Carol Burnett, in fact, several with Carol Burnett, and every single one of them, she's got a short, straight skirt and high heels. And it's so nice to be here in Zoom format where, you know, I don't have to worry about that. So I'm sort of at a loss of what to say, except that I'm truly relieved or pleased to see you all here. And some of you are aware of this journey from a long time ago. I see Leo Landis is here. He now is with the State Historical Society, and he worked in the ISU Special Collections Department back in the 90s when he was a doctoral student, and we had a grant from the State Historical Society to archive materials, and it's great to have him here. Some local friends, my sister Clara Hoover from Omaha. I won't point you all out, but I can't believe the book is done. It's 30 years of doubting and yet trotting along, and I'm just grateful to all the people, from those who let me interview them to those who didn't chase me out of their farm fields when I came to videotape or photograph, and just genuinely grateful. I don't know of a better era in my life. I love my urban farm here in Ames. I love being able to carry out some of my heritage, but to do it in a whole different cultural context.
Well, we look forward to exploring your book in more detail. And before doing so, let's also introduce Dr. Cornelia Butler Flora, the Charles F. Curtis Distinguished Professor of Agriculture and Sociology Emerita, Iowa State, and Research Professor, Kansas State. Dr. Flora has over 5 decades of work on the indicators of development around the community capitals framework, which include natural, cultural, human, social, political, financial, and built in the United States, the EU, and in developing countries. Her current research addresses alternative strategies of community development and community-based natural resource management in the light of changing socio-technical regimes and climate change. Welcome, Dr. Flora.
Thank you very much. This is very exciting to get to talk about Helen's incredible book and the kinds of research that went into it and the stories that it tells.
Thank you. So to open our discussion, I thought it would be perfectly fitting to read the opening paragraphs from Helen's preface. The story that begins in the 1880s when my Gunderson ancestors came to Iowa until now as I sit here in California, wondering where I find a sense of homeland, is not a unique drama. It parallels a whole era of Midwestern rural life. It is an era that began with people seeking new land for farms, homes, and communities. It is an era that totters now as people struggle either to remain a part of that land or move away, seeking new places to call home in this modern age when such a small percentage of the population lives in rural America or is involved in farming. The story of the rise and fall of the Midwest is not one to be explored solely by Iowans or other Midwesterners. As author Wendell Berry says, the crisis of agriculture is a crisis of culture. What the Midwest and the state of Iowa are going through, and what I experience as an expatriate, are connected to issues of the country as a whole. These issues are related to meaning, vision, and values, and to environmental, economic, and spiritual health, end quote. So Helen, first off, how did this project come about? How did it evolve, and how does it relate to your other work?
Instead of giving the whole lifelong story, I had gone to California in 1981 to go to seminary, not with the intent of becoming ordained minister, because I don't like to get up on Sunday mornings that early, and I'm not always that nice a person. But I did think it was a valuable experience to go to seminary. It was a Presbyterian seminary, and after I graduated, I was at a loss of what to do. And I realized, though, that I could take up my interest in photography and in video much more seriously than I had before. And I decided to come back to Iowa on what I called photophories. I thought I was going to cover the whole state and do a book of photographs on rural Iowa. As it turned out, I shared some of my ideas for projects with Lauren Horton, who was a senior historian at the State Historical Society. And I told him that one of my project ideas was right there in my backyard, where I discovered that on this 11-mile stretch of road, where there used to be 11 farm families when I was growing up and riding the school bus, there were only 4 farms left. And I believe at the time, there were no school children left. Used to be that the school children from that road filled up half the bus. And I said, or I could do a documentary. I could focus on corn cribs and their significance, or grain elevators, or this or that. And Lauren said, Helen, it's right there in your backyard, document that road. And so in the fall of 1989, I got on this photophory and covered a lot of Iowa, including photographing some places along the road where there were maybe 1 or 2 buildings left or no buildings. And eventually, once I decided on that project, I went back to that road many times. I was fortunate to be able to stay with the Ulrich family in Pocahontas. Ruth was the director of the Pocahontas Public Library. And it was a way to come back and be in touch with my heritage, but yet be distant from it. And I could gather images or eventually do oral history interviews. And then maybe I felt I'd gotten a little bit too close to the culture of my yesteryear, and then I could go back to California. And so I got some grant proposal money at different times from Humanities Iowa, or from the State Historical Society, or from the Arts Council, and began doing some writing for the book in about 1995, and really had a lot of ideas, but had a lot of writer's block. And I think part of that is coming from a heritage where if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. And I had some angst about my rural background and had some things I might have wanted to say. I think I found that it's true what I read from another author was that she had been a photographer for a long time. And eventually she realized that her gift was in writing because photography was a safe way to sort of express yourself. But by writing, you came in touch with more of the details and maybe expressed things that were more difficult to share. So by 2004, I had written all of the book except the last chapter. Well, all of the book that was at that time, I thought I'd finish the book all but the last chapter. And I even used PageMaker software and laid it out with photos. And I thought all I had to do is write 10 more pages for that final chapter and I'll be done, but I just could not bring myself to do that. And I think part of the struggle was that my parents were still alive. I didn't know how much of myself I could truly express and not upset them. And actually the story about the road wasn't really done until my mother died in 2004 and my father died in 2010. And I often thought the story doesn't really end for me until they no longer live on that road. And then my sister Clara inherited the farm place and the house. And we knew all the time that eventually that place would be torn down because basically the family didn't want it in other people's hands, but it was a building site for conventional agriculture with big grain bins and big equipment and chemicals mixed up there. And so finally, I don't think she realized she had such an emotional connection to it. I think she thought she could arrange to have it torn down somewhat pragmatically, but finally she was able to do that in 2018. And fortunately, I was able to be there and photograph and videotape the process. And then I don't think it was that spring, maybe it was that spring. Anyway, the following fall, Rachel Carricker, I never know how exactly to pronounce her last name, from the ISU Foundation, who's the liaison to the library, had lined up a meeting for me with Beth McNeil, who is the director of the library. And my sister Clara was co-chair of the Friends of the Library back in the early 1990s. And that's sort of how I got connected with the Special Collections Department. And that's where I intend to leave some of my land to benefit a rural archives there. But I was expressing to Beth that I was realizing what a gift it was to have Special Collections archiving my materials. And yet I had to realize that they had gifts in that area, but I couldn't expect them to be a therapist or a writing mentor or help me get over my writer's block. And I said, I'm content with that because their services are so wonderful for me. But she was saying, well, the university no longer had an ISU press as such, but the library was starting up a digital press and they would be happy to publish my book if I finished it. So that started things in place for January of 2019. I was able to get Adam Wright, who I knew he had worked here on my urban farm and he had a master's in environmental science and sustainable ag and creative writing. And he was a great cheerleader and mentor and spirit guide, I guess you would say. And so he helped me. And eventually we decided that it would be best for me to work with a commercial press. So I worked with through 2020 with Hoist Printing in Ames. And they use basically the same layout that I'd already done with PageMaker in 2004, but Adobe Corporation they've done it so that you can't use those old files in the new equipment. So Hoy started over from scratch. And with Adam's help, I had written not just 10 more pages, but I'd written 5 more chapters. And then when there were such delays and March and April of 2020 came along and the pandemic, then I wrote the final chapter, which is a perspective from the pandemic. And then I had some waiting to do on hoist printing, but I think that's natural with any creative project. And finally, on about December 28th, 2020, they had printed and bound 100 copies of the book. So.
And just as a heads up for those attending, at the end in our slides, we'll have more information on how to access those files. So there are 2 volumes in PDF format that you can download freely from the digital press. And there's also information on how to get the book.
If you will mute me, I thought I had Kleenexes in my pocket, but I don't. So I'm going to go grab a Kleenex.
Okay. Let's see,
Personal books are not easy to write, but they tell us so much, and they're really important.
So Dr. Flora, while Helen is getting back, there we go. So one of the themes, or certainly in your subtitle, Helen, which is a vanishing era, you talk about something that you can't go home to again. So Helen, talk about what that means for you.
Well, I think, I don't think I recognized this when I was a child or even growing up, but you know, a lot of us end up in therapy at some time in our lives. And after I graduated from seminary, I worked with a therapist, and I realized how much grief I had in relationship to my grandfather. My grandpa and grandma had lived on the home place farm and 3 miles away, and we would visit them, and it just was it's a significant part of my life. And so I realized that the grief I had, unresolved grief from when I was 11, when grandpa died, and then realized, coming back to Iowa, well, backing up, so realizing that grief, and then also realizing that I felt somewhat like an exile because I had loved so much about farming when I was a child, and had in some ways wanted to grow up to be a farmer like my father or grandfather. But my perception was that girls did not grow up to be farmers, they could be farm wives. And I knew that didn't really fit me. Now, of course, I was a little bit biased because, not biased, but a different perspective, because my mother had grown up as a city woman in Ogden, Utah, where her father had a retail or wholesale hardware company. And they were more country club set, and she'd come to Iowa to go to Iowa State to major in applied art, and she met my father there. And I wouldn't say she didn't ever do any farm work, but basically she didn't do any farm work. And she did take lunch out to Dad in the field and mend his trousers and feed him and raise his kids, and you know, host the couples club card parties and that kind of thing. But so I would go on and I would major in physical education and live other places, and I had what I would say a meaningful life and meaningful activities, but I just realized that I always had this feeling of an exile that although I owned farmland, there wasn't a place, for me on it. And then to travel back and photograph the area and to see how much it had changed, and then to learn economically how the economies were failing and how the county was losing, a lot of population. In fact, I looked it up. The county, Pocahontas County, was losing as much or more population than any other county in the country. So I don't think we'd ever thought of our area as being impoverished. We might have thought of Native American reservations or ghettos or different places as being impoverished, and I saw that. And so it was just a lot of grief. And another thing is I'm single. I like being single. I'm a liberal, and I just think that even though there are good people in my home county, that the institutions are made would not be comfortable for me. And I didn't know if I could ever move back to Iowa. I had sort of a love-hate for it, but being able to come to Ames, I think a lot of people like to retire in college towns, and so I retired here. So I eventually in '97 started managing my own land, which is a major change for me. And I've also learned a lot from my association with Practical Farmers of Iowa, whether it's been staff members or friends there who have helped me along. And there was even a time when I did some video work in the late '90s and saw a lot of PFI people in action and talked with them. And then in 2006, I was fortunate to find this urban farm. And I can do a diverse kind of agriculture here that just would be hard to do in Pocahontas County.
Dr. Flora, I'd like to bring you in here. So I'd be interested to get your thoughts on how your work specifically examines the dynamics of stability and change in rural communities.
Well, we use something called a community capitals framework. And what that does is give us various lenses to see what's going on in communities, what are the assets that are there, and as Helen has documented, how they change over time and how decline in one affects what happens in the other, or vice versa. And what Helen's book did for me is that it focused on the notion of place, but what does place really mean? And so we look first at natural capital. What are the animals? What is the vegetation? What is the watershed? What is the water? What is the air? What is the temperature? All of this are really important parts of what place means. But particularly with industrial agriculture, made that place, in terms of natural capital, change rather rapidly and not necessarily for the good. The next is cultural capital. And this is one of the things Helen brings out as well. Cultural capital is the meaning that we give the place to other people. And what Helen has done so well is see, on the one hand, the culture of agriculture, which was at that point very much defined as a male activity, meant that she couldn't do what she really wanted to do, but she's doing it now. But the point is, what is that culture you take with you, and how do you understand the impact of that culture on you? And I was thinking, very interesting, that she sees rural culture for its virtues, like all those kids on the school bus together, but also its problems in terms of not being very accepting of difference very often, and how hard that makes it for people who are different, think differently. The next is human capital, which are the skills and abilities of each and every person. And farming requires a whole lot of different abilities. And Helen learned those abilities, but she couldn't really apply them in that situation where the land was changing hands. So she went out and enhanced her human capital, which was done through education, but the best human capital and learning comes from doing. And I hate this as a college professor, but it's not from sitting in college classes. And how do you then go about that? Next is social capital. And these are relations among people. And it's interesting that in writing this book, this is something that held Helen back, because on the one hand, she didn't want to damage those relationships. But if she indeed wrote about what she knew and what she saw, there would be positive and negative things to say. And to keep those relationships, she chose to postpone saying them. Next is political capital. And those are the policies that they happen when norms and values of a community turn into standards of what should be. And then those standards then are turned into your norms and values and standards then get turned into rules and regulations, which influence then what goes on in that place. And what Helen was observing over time was how, unfortunately, sometimes political capital was used to, frankly, depopulate rural areas. I mean, when you focus on 2 crops and they're row crops, it makes it very difficult for those diverse ecosystems to prevail. Which brings us to financial capital. And I think one of the things that Helen points out very well is what happens when natural capital, which is that place, turns into mainly only being financial capital. And the goal is get as much as you can out of it. And what we've seen, particularly in Iowa, well, all through the Midwest, as farmers get fewer, land prices go up, actually, and land prices are looking pretty good right now. But that's not what's important about place. And so it's sort of these contradictions between these different capitals. And finally, there's built capital. And she documents how this has changed over time, the structures that have to go, the structures that came to support industrial agriculture, and then how those, when they saw what was going to happen on their land, said, well, maybe we should take out these structures that held all these poison chemicals. Maybe we're going to have to change this. And to see, on the one hand, the value that these structures held for her grandfather and her father, and yet understand that they were going to be taken out, is very painful, because there are these contradictions. So what we're seeing is, what are these capitals coming together for? And what I love about Helen's work, and glad that she postponed it till she had her Ermine farm going, is you can take some of those things about the essence of place, the diversity of the environment, the meaning that it has, the strength it gives to you, particularly through being able to eat well because you're eating things you grow, and there's a diversity of them because you know you need a diverse diet. And then the social capital, the relationships, and Helen's farm is all about relationships. That young people and old people, they're constantly gatherings. And there's a saying in community development that you make a living by what you get, you make a life by what you live. And what Helen has done such a good job in on her urban farm is giving. She's part of the Students in Sustainable Agriculture's urban farm. She helps them with their food at first, bringing food, always making her wonderful bread. These kinds of things allow these relationships and new cultures to form and around a place, but the place means so much more. So I think that these are important pieces of the book that can tell us a lot about what's going on with the lifestyle in rural Iowa, help us understand what it was, and then help us think about how can it be in the future. And I think that's why looking at the urban farm, somebody put in the chat, they miss the community meals, our chances to be together. But I think looking forward to these are important pieces of what creates place that is not just a particular geographic point, but is all these different capitals that come together that we create and recreate to keep place going.
Excellent, thank you. Now I'd like to turn to an exploration of some of the primary themes that I picked from the book. So first, picking up sustainability and stewardship. So in volume 2 on page 46, Helen writes, in a perfect world, owning land should have something to do with being connected to that land, like knowing about the soils, the people who farm it, and the ethics involved in managing it. Helen, what does sustainability and stewardship mean to you?
Well, I know from my friends who are students or faculty in the Iowa State University Sustainable Ag program that that's probably one of the big discussions they have for incoming students, because it's easy to be glib and think, well, of course, everybody knows what sustainability is and they all agree with me. But I think there are many, many definitions. As an example, somebody might say that, well, organic agriculture is more sustainable than conventional agriculture. And yet organic agriculture, at least as many people do it, involves more tillage, which is not as good on the soil health, involves more passes of the tractors for cultivation and could cause more compaction. Organic agriculture might require more labor intensive, which might be more wearing on the farmer. So to say organic farming is more sustainable because it doesn't use chemicals, I'm sure the conventional farmers would say, well, it's because of these chemicals that we can actually do a better job of agriculture. I think there are even people that say sustainable agriculture doesn't go far enough. We don't want to just sustain the status quo. We want more regenerative agriculture, but still, I think sustainable just means being conscientious about choices and not necessarily just going along with what the seed dealer or the chemical company or the local co-op is telling you, to do. In terms of stewardship, when I was in seminary, and by the way, I was probably the most biblically illiterate seminarian that existed, but it was interesting to take the courses in Old Testament, especially about the prophets, spelled Prophets. And they came at it from an agrarian sociology model in which the Exodus back to Israel and various stories around that had to do with the fact that in that culture, the king, who was at the top of the population pyramid or social structure, would buy up subsistence crop land and convert it into vineyards and olive orchards to sell the grapes and the olives or the wine, to be able to either trade or sell that to get materials of war. Now, I once knew what those materials of war would be, and I've tried to look it up and research it, whether it would be iron or for chariots or horses, but like I say, I'm not that astute of a historian, but the same is sort of true today with what's the story about if the Pentagon had to have bake sales in order to fund their budget. A lot of our resources in our country go toward creating war or defense. Also, prior to seminary, I worked in Fargo and had coordinated a hunger symposium and met many leaders of thought in that field. And at the time, they were saying that a lot of issues had to do with absentee landowners that lived completely elsewhere and didn't have a particular connection with the land except to get their rent checks from it. And of course, I was kind of disturbed and conflicted because I was an absentee landowner. And so I think realizing I was an absentee landowner, realizing that issues of land and managing land had an ethical, religious, spiritual component, just meant that I didn't want to return. Unfortunately, I've gotten very dependent on the income from my farm, and that's been conflicting because I thought I could maybe have more latitude, more flexibility to make alternative decisions if I had succeeded in some other career and had a fine paycheck from that. Anyway, so that was kind of a dilemma, being dependent on farm income, but knowing that there were ethical issues related to getting farm income. And so I don't know if I would say I've done the best I can. I've done what I could in that compromise. But, you know, if you listen to the experts in the field of economics and economics and population and sociology, you'll see things like the inverse correlation, like Pocahontas County, as the corn yields increase, the population line, decreases. And this may come some from what I've read from people like Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's written the book Braiding Sweetgrass. It may come from some of my current influences, but I also think as a child, and I see Pam Jordan Wolf there. She grew up in that area, and the farm that they lived on, their South Farm, was a farm that eventually my father bought it. And I don't know if the Jordans had moved to their North Farm by then, but I remember going with Dad and walking through that wonderful farmstead where Mary Jane Jordan and Russ had their farm. And Dad was talking about, okay, well, yeah, he was analyzing what trees would come out, what buildings would come out. And in the backyard, there was either a plum tree or a cherry tree. I said, that's going to come out too? He said, yeah. And I just, you just don't see that anymore. It is gone. It is gone. And I can remember for a long time, there were just 2 buildings left there, bean field or cornfield all around them. I've got some photographs of them. And I had been at an event in Rolfe, forget what it was. And I came driving down that road, and I was just drawn to stop there. And the tune, We Gathered Together to Ask the Lord's Blessing, came to me. And it was only minutes later that I learned that Mary Jane had died. She'd had Parkinson's for a number of years. So I think it would be easy for somebody in a jet plane going over to see this as flyover country and just these big wide open fields and not realize the culture that was there.
Mhm. Picking up on that, another key theme, Helen, of the many other I wish we could explore tonight is ethics and spirituality. So in volume 2, you write, "What I have learned is the need for people interested in spiritual growth to feel their pain and learn from it. It is not as though a mindful person tries or can escape feelings such as anger, grief, and depression, or the circumstances that precipitated those feelings. However, the lesson is for those people to let go of the judging what the pain means and be attuned to the essence of who they are under the crust of those feelings." So Helen and Dr. Flora, both of your work talks about religiosity, spirituality in agriculture, particularly for women. So please feel free to talk about, that influence on life and work.
Well, I don't know how directly this answers that, but I can remember when I was teaching school in Duluth, and when the principal would call me in for my annual evaluation, and then things would go pretty well, but he would say, "But Helen, you're letting your girls wear, swim in the pool without swimming caps on and their long hair, and that's a no-no." And yet I knew the men's swimming coach let his boys with long hair do the same. And I just flushed up, I just choked up and cried, but I sort of had learned to be able to say, you may think these are tears of sadness, but these are tears of anger. And I think we can judge ourselves and say, well, why am I so obstreperous? Why am I acting out in school? Why am I getting a red F in citizenship from Miss Corsair in 6th grade? Why don't I seem to fit in? Is it just because there's something bad about me? And I think when you don't have avenues that honor your feelings or outlets to express them, and then they can just fester and be destructive. But nothing lasts forever. I mean, you can feel sorrow, but that's in the moment. And like if you watch a child who's angry, if you sort of let them have some room, eventually they're laughing. And I think also there's a lot of wisdom in our anger or in our sorrow. It helped me a lot to do expressive arts, drawing, to take Mr. Sketch magic markers and draw pictures, and you learn from that. And then I don't know if that direct, I hate it when political candidates evade the question they're asked. So if you think I'm evading the question you're asking, say, Helen, we asked you this question. So.
Since we're at 6:45, feel free to ask questions if you want to unmute or post them to the chat. But Dr. Flora, is there anything you'd like to address there in terms of picking up on the religious and spiritual aspects?
Yes, there's religion, and then there's the relations that religion gives you to all those capitals. And I'm not from here. That's why my background's different. I was born and raised in California on a Navy base in the middle of the Mojave Desert. And we were divided into 3 religious groups. We could be Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish. The Protestants and Catholics had a huge Quonset hut where you had a rotating altar. Christ was on the cross for the Catholics, off the cross for the Protestants. But those of you who know Protestants know every manner of worldview is contained there. So for me, going to church and going to Sunday school, which I did regularly, I was so eager to join the church, was a discussion. It wasn't memorizing rules. It was sort of figuring out, how is it we become closer to God and therefore closer to everyone around us? And I think that's what we mean by spirituality, and how that can make us feel close to a creator, but also responsible for what goes on the land. And actually, I have a presentation on sociology of soil, where we began changing what we saw from dirt to this incredible life that's within the soil. And I think this is part of the spirituality and responsibility, is looking beneath the surface and figuring out, how does all this fit together and how do I make it better?
Okay. Would anyone like to ask a question right now?
I'd like to ask Helen to comment on the first sentence she wrote in an essay, not one of these books, but it sort of falls on the heels of the religion part of things. There are false gods. For many people writing nostalgically, you don't write nostalgically, but for people who write nostalgically, family dynasties or family trees are just immense. You wrote in this essay, I think family dynasties are overblown, or I don't believe in family dynasties. Could you comment on that?
Well, I think that was specifically in regard to land dynasties, where land gets handed down from generation to generation to generation, even when the heirs may be remotely removed from the land, never lived there, never identify with it. And I realize that in some ways that's how our system works. And there's wealth in that capital possession. And so can I blame families for doing that? I guess not. But on the other hand, it would be nice, instead of, for instance, Iowa has the Century Farm program, where if a family's name is on the deed for a parcel of land for 100 years, then they're a Century Farm. And then if they have their name on the same piece of land for 150 years, that's, I don't know if it's a different category, but they go to the state and the governor gives them a certificate for hanging on to this. And I'm not sure that's always virtuous. And wouldn't it be nice if there was a similar program to honor people who had found a way to divest of that land and make it so that somebody with a closer connection to it could farm it? I also think of, if you think of corporations and people who are stockholders, there are people who own stock, who take an interest in what the company is doing and trying to influence it. And there are other people who own stock that don't care, as long as they get their check each year. But my personal bias is that it'd be nicer if, even if you were, and a group of us the other day were talking about the term absentee landowner. What could it be called other than absentee? I think, like, if you have an older person who's not capable of making decisions for themselves anymore, what do you assign them? A guardian? Aren't we more like guardians of the land? And whether we live in California, we live in Iowa, we can make conscientious choices for, quote unquote, the sustainability of that land. And I think it's, the other thing is, land is not capital commodity. I mean, it has become that. But when you think of the soil as having a life, I don't think I ever thought of that before, what all is in that soil. And in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about, I think it was nurturing a patch of sweetgrass. And they even did some research. And the patches that were cared for grew better and were healthier than the ones that weren't. And it was like the earth and the sweetgrass were responding to the care and appreciating it. And so then I was thinking about the row crop land of Pocahontas County. Does the land care for us even when we don't do nurturing things to it? Is the land provide unconditional love and care for us? Or would the land be better off, appreciate it more if we were more nurturing? And is there a connection between how we treat the land and the health of the economy, the health of the people? There's a lot of cancer in that area. So.
Other questions?
We have various ways that people can like silt the our ways that we have set up in Iowa so that people can put their land into a resilient, food producing, diverse place where new farmers or young farmers can get a start. And I think these are the kinds of things we really need to look to and learn from. But unfortunately, well, it's not, but people who can do that, to turn their land over, you get some tax breaks, but not a whole lot. But you have to have some sort of wealth to be even able to do that. And what we're concerned about, or must be concerned about, are the people who don't have the wealth to be as generous as they would like, or even do on the land as they would like to do, because there are these short-term economic pressures.
Pressures like paying for their nursing home costs.
Yes, most of the absentee landowners, I just saw a study on this, in Iowa, live in Iowa. But most of them are, probably the majority of them are women, and many of them are in nursing homes.
There's also a concern. I know some foundation in Iowa had a big push several years ago saying with the demographics such as they are, with the land owned pretty much by older people, that either if they moved or when they died, their estate went to out of state people, all of that wealth that would supposedly leave the state and go elsewhere. And so their idea was to encourage as many people as possible to invest in community foundations in Iowa while they still had control of their land.
On that note, are there any final thoughts or words, Helen or Dr. Flora, you would add before we move to plugs?
Well, I just want to say that it's really worthwhile to download the book, to buy the book, to have the chance to read it and reflect on what Helen says, because she talks very openly about her life and what she sees. But I think it causes the reader to also reflect on what does this mean for me? And here's where I'm back to the notion of place, that road you grew up on. What does that mean and how has it changed? And what are ways that that impacts you? And by knowing that, what can you do that can impact other people? And what I think is so wonderful about what Helen is doing is that with her urban farm, she is impacting a lot of people here in Ames and in Story County and further beyond, in fact.
Thank you. And so I must say, Daniel over there, our moderator, is new in the past 2 years to Ames.
Yep.
And he's the head of the University Archives and Special Collections Department that's on the top floor of the ISU Parks Library. And Sister Clara was the, like I said earlier, was a co-chair of the Friends of the Library. And when I moved back to Iowa in '93, the library was having a celebration of its 2 millionth volume. And she invited me to a brunch. And I thought it would be too hoity-toity for me, but I thought this is one way I could easily do something for Clara. And I went, and it was really marvelous. Even the president of the president's wife, Patty Jiske, I sat at a table with her, and she was talking about conservation reserve projects and prairie restoration. And wow, this is cool. And then they were asking me about things, and I told them some about my work, and they said, well, you need to meet Tyler Walters. He's over there. He's the head of the Special Collections Department. So I went over and talked to him, and I said, hi, I'm Helen. Well, what's the Special Collections? He said, well, we really try to enable people to collect materials. We just can't afford to support them in the way we'd like to. And so it wasn't much later that I went to him and said, I'm looking for a sponsor for a grant proposal to the State Historical Society. And we got it, and Leo Landis worked on it, and Daniel's department has had my collection of materials ever since then. And my intention is, besides supporting Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation and Practical Farmers of Iowa with my estate, is to benefit that program, especially to develop a more substantial rural archives, because sometimes, like when I initially started researching to find old film footage or photographs of rural Iowa, there was so little to find. And also over the years, I've read a lot of material by Curtis Harnack's work, We've All Gone Away, and different stories about rural Iowa. And most of them are written by men who have fond memories of things that I don't have fond memories of. And, or written by women who just talk about how great everything was and how they learned a much better work ethic than today's young people, and seemingly kind of bigoted about that. And so I'm proud to offer my perspective, whether you would call it a woman's perspective or just a candid perspective. It is my perspective.
And we thank you for your support and your perspective, and we encourage everyone to come into Special Collections and University Archives and to, examine and explore Helen's materials, and might I say, quite selfishly, the amazing photographs. She's got an amazing eye, and I look forward to talking offline with Helen about photography. But with that, let's go ahead, and I think we have some slides. So I mentioned how to find more information about Helen's book. So from her website, gunderfriend.com, you can find more information about Helen and her projects, including some links to her book. And then for the digital version, you can access both volumes as PDFs from the Iowa State University Digital Press, which I think we also have a slide for. Bingo. And also, feel free to subscribe to the library's newsletter, as well as the Ames Public Library newsletter. These events are free and open to the public, and we encourage broad attendance. And as this tonight's discussion was evident, there's an amazing wealth of information to be gleaned, but it's hard to do in just 1 hour. So feel free to connect with Helen and to explore her book, and stick around for social hour. So Helen, I think what I'm going to do is going to go ahead and capture the chat. So there's lots of great thoughts that were expressed and congratulations and warm wishes for you. So I'll save and share those with you, but we'll stop the recording now and we can move to social hour.
I've never been in a social hour before on